Hi everyone, and a warm welcome to today's webinar. I'm so excited to have everyone joining. So while we get started and see that people are coming in, my name is Cecilia Hamrin, and I will be the host for today's seminar. The topic for today, as you might have seen, is the strategic trends within the manufacturing industry. And this is a series we will have throughout the year. So this is the first event for the year. And we will focus on this then throughout the year on the trends on the manufacturing industry. But for today, we will start with two keynote presentations to start with. And then we'll finish off with a panel discussion where we will bring in questions from the audience. So feel free to share your questions throughout the panel discussion, and we will make sure to try to cover as many questions as possible. But let's get started with our first speaker. So Markus Forsgren is a partner at McKinsey and co-leads McKinsey's work for the industrial service sector in Europe, helping industrial companies to grow with a focus in the manufacturing industry. So happy to have you here today, Markus. And we're really excited to get started with your presentation. Are you there and can you hear me?
I hear you well.
Yes. So whenever you're ready, I'll hand over the word to you, and we're happy to have you get
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and get the opportunity to present and discuss with all of you. If you can help move the slides, Cecilia, or
yeah, of course. Sorry, we'll do.
Let's see if we can.
Yeah. Now you should be able to do your part. Sorry, that was on my side.
Let's see in here. Now it seems to work. Yes. So as mentioned, I will talk a bit about what we see as the big trends, or also partly what is already what we would say new normal in the types of sectors from which many of you are present. Of course, there is a lot that is going on in these sectors, and not the least has been over the last couple of years. So it's, of course, in some ways hard to summarize or synthesize well into a few things, but at least if we try, we would argue that there is three main themes, or call it megatrends. So there's one around sustainability, including decarbonization and circularity. There's one big theme, as we see it, around digital customer experience and digital customer journeys in your B2B industries, basically. And then, in addition, there is macroeconomic uncertainty. And I think what is interesting, and as we will also come to a little bit in a while, is how these three megatrends interact with each other and create additional and reinforce additional trends in between them. If I start with the first one around sustainability, there's a couple of things that we see. I think one is that there has been, and I would say probably starting over the last 1 to 2 years only, a big shift in viewing sustainability as a value driver, and not only as sort of a risk to be managed. Clearly, we see an acceleration in shift to electric drivetrains across many sectors, and there we expect the big shift to continue over the coming years. And the last one that we see here is also a hunt for zero carbon materials in the sort of hunt to meet quite ambitious targets that many of you are committing to. So if I talk a little bit about the first one, this is a relatively complex chart, but it basically outlines what are some of the areas relating to sustainability that we see our clients working with, where you see a couple of areas in the, and also how they affect enterprise value of these clients. And it's clearly so that there is a couple of levers around minimizing risks, avoiding to do business in polluting sectors, and things like that. That will avoid, high cost of capital. That will avoid the market share loss and so on. And that I think has been the case for a while. But what is interesting is to see how it's really shifting to a much more offensive game, where we see companies in the sector investing quite a lot and moving quite fast when it comes to, of course, innovating new products and offerings around their core business, but also, expanding to adjacencies and trying to build new green corporate ventures, and also how ambitious they are in marketing, and really making a big part of company vision and mission in this area. And we also see that for many of them, this has already driven quite a lot of value for these companies. The other trend that I mentioned is the shift to electric, and we all see it, especially on the passenger car side. But what is clear is that when it comes also now to more industrial machinery like buses, commercial vehicles, more and more also mining equipment, construction equipment, and many other sectors, the shift to electric drivetrains is really accelerating. And it starts to be fewer and fewer applications where electric drivetrains are not TCO superior to combustion equivalents. So right now we would probably argue the bottleneck is more on the supply side, but we expect this to continue to accelerate. The third point here is on the topic of decarbonizing supply chains, linked to the fact that many of you have committed to ambitious targets when it comes to carbon emissions. We see many companies work hard to basically replace input materials with ones with much less carbon footprint. This chart is one example for green steel, and where we see, an expectation on the left-hand side for overall flat steel demand and green flat steel demand by 2030. And then next to it on the right-hand side in the green bars, we see what is the announced and projected availability or supply of the equivalent green steel by the same time frame. And it's quite clear to us that even if we are optimistic and all announcements would materialize, it's very likely that there will be a shortage of materials. And the green steel is just one example, but we see it across many commodities. Then here we jumped further to the third mega trend around digital customer experience. And to mention three things here. One is that we see the omni-channel go-to-market model really scaling now, and basically being present in almost all subsectors and for almost all types of transactions. We also have seen a steep acceleration when it comes to service and aftermarket, and the aspects of doing that, much more of that, as we say, contactless, so in remote or through more digitized means. And I will share a couple of examples here from a few recent surveys we have done in this area. So this is a survey we've done on omnichannel. And to mention a few things here, right? We basically seen the last couple of years that there's been a drastic increase, 70% net increase in what we call hybrid sales roles. So this is roles where the responsibility is similar to a normal sales role, but where the majority of the work is done through a digital channel rather than in person. I think also interesting example here is that now we see 10 or more channels are regularly used by B2B customers to interact with suppliers. And that is a figure that 5 years ago was only 5 channels. And we could go on, but there's just a drastic acceleration here, obviously heavily driven by the pandemic. And it's, I think also we can note that this also results in much higher expectations now from customers in terms of what customer journeys should look like, what you're expected to be able to do when it comes to serving them in digital means and so on. And of course, many of these B2B buyers also get expectations in their, let's say, professional role that is affected by what they can do in their private role and what is happening in B2C. This chart shows on the service side, basically, as you can see here, in this big survey we did, a majority of respondents say that they have either fully deployed or is currently scaling contactless ways to the service. And we see it across, as you see here, installation, equipment maintenance and repair, part sales, etc. Obviously, this also was heavily accelerated by the pandemic. The picture just 2 years ago was very different to this. The third area is around macroeconomic uncertainty, which of course involves many things, but one that is probably very clear for many of you at the moment is disruptions to supply chains, difficulty to get the right components and materials in time, and efforts to mitigate this by, again, moving to more local supply chain setups. Another one is managing the return of inflation, which I'm sure also you started to see quite clearly, as well as getting prepared for a more geopolitically challenging environment. And just to mention some anecdotes on the supply chain side. So here's a couple of charts on how raw material prices on metals has increased during the pandemic. The famous semiconductor or infamous semiconductor situation in the middle, as well as global freight capacity. And as you can see here, although probably the worst period may be over, at least we expect significant time until these things have materialized to a more normal pre-pandemic level. If I continue then, as I mentioned, these different trends are also interacting with each other and resulting in a few quite interesting additional sort of sub-trends. One of them being the emergence of equipment as a service that we see really takes off now in more and more sectors. Also the shift to transforming whole business models to enable a more circular business. And also we see how software is coming more and more critical and more embedded in the overall offering of any manufacturing company. If we look a little bit at equipment as a service, I think this has been talked about in many sectors for quite some time. With a few exceptions like aircraft engines, it hasn't really materialized. But if I look back the last 1 to 2 years, see now that this shift is really starting to accelerate in many sectors, and there's many clients that are reaching out to us on these topics at the moment. And you see here some of the trends, and we mentioned a few, right? So one is people being influenced what they see in their B2C context as private professionals. Also, more and more in companies see how these types of business models are preferential when it comes to aligning interest of a supplier with the interest of a customer, and probably especially in challenging times that we see now and have seen for a couple of years. This makes it easier to do good business together. If we mention the topic of circularity and circular business models, we see that this is a topic that is on mind of many of our clients. There are structural differences making it a bigger challenge in some sectors than others. That is outlined here. But we see momentum in this topic basically across this chart, although starting points are quite different. If we look at also the investing community, it's also very clear that circularity and circular business models is becoming a more important topic. Here you see an example of total investments going into this space, and investment funds focused on some examples of investment funds focused on this area as another evidence that this is gonna grow and be a bigger theme in the future. And as it does, we also see that for many manufacturing companies, this has pretty fundamental implications to the overall business model. Obviously, the offering and the revenue model applied needs to be different, usually very much in line with the equipment as a service setup that we talked about before. Of course, it has fundamental implications on product design, how you set up the physical business system to allow for good remanufacturing and recirculation of physical products. But probably the biggest challenges that we now see many companies work with is how to set up financing and risk management to successfully scale these types of business models, and also how to build a digital backbone that often with a digital twin of the equipment in the installed base makes it possible to manage performance and manage risk of products in the system. And it also has implications on governance. So this feels like something that is still in the early days, but where we continue to see an acceleration and expect quite exciting years ahead. So that was a quick rundown. There's of course a lot more that can be said on these trends and other trends. And we are happy, of course, to connect with many of you offline as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Markus, for your presentation. And Markus will come back also in the panel discussion, but now we will move over to our next speakers, and that is Daniel Hellquist here at Tacton. Daniel has been here for 1.5 years, working as a business development manager, focusing on business development at the intersection between product and marketing. And Daniel is also leading our trends analysis and also hosting our advisory board. So a warm welcome to you, Daniel, and we're so glad to have you here.
There we go. Thank you, Cecilia, for that nice introduction. So I'm Daniel Hellquist, and for the next roughly 15-ish minutes, I'll be focusing on two things. So one is the top manufacturing trends for 2022 that we see here at Tacton, and then kind of dive a bit deeper into what are the implications to manufacturers. And you'll definitely recognize a bit of it from Markus's presentation just right now, which I thought was excellent. So well done, Markus. So there we go. Thank you for your help, Cecilia. So I have a few slides here, and this first one, I'll just give you a high-level overview of the trends, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into them. So the first major trend that we have identified here for 2022 at Tacton is what we call disruption proof. And that's really driven by the pandemic, that manufacturers are prioritizing resiliency and the ability to quickly adapt to market changes. So basically, in a nutshell, manufacturers are sick of being disrupted continuously, if it's factory shutdowns or people at home sick or whatever, or if it's a supply chain issue. And historically, manufacturers have really been operating kind of with very thin margins, so kind of building in more protectiveness into their margins and more resiliency in how they operate and how do they do business. The second major trend that we see here at Tacton is something that we call the power of experience. And that's really a continuation of a trend that we've seen over a number of years, and that is the B2B buying patterns and expectations. They continue to follow those set in the B2C space. So as a private individual, as a consumer, those expectations that I have on the products and services that I interact with, I bring those with me into my day at a manufacturer buyer, and really have those same expectations on the services and products that I use in my business life. And this becomes especially true now with millennials gaining more buying power and gaining traction within their respective organizations that have really grown up with this internet first generation and are really demanding very seamless and high quality user experiences online. And then the third trend that we talk about a lot here at Tacton and that we're looking at for 2022 is the evolving value chains. And that's really all about that manufacturers are reevaluating and making long-term changes to the role they play in the value chain. So things that go in here are kind of trying to understand the entire customer life cycle and really understanding the manufacturing role in that. Sustainability goes into there, and also equipment as a service. So those are the three main trends, and I'll dive a little bit deeper into them. But then we also have two kind of mega trends or super trends that kind of supersede and permeate into these trends, and that's sustainability. Markus covered a bunch of good stuff about that, so I don't feel like I need to talk a whole lot more about that. And I don't know, DJ, who's coming up, will talk about that as well. But then this trend of equipment as a service, this push towards access instead of ownership. Historically, manufacturers have produced the product and then sold it as a one-off. And then kind of that's where the relationship has more or less ended. But now there's a much stronger push from the buying side that they want access to the equipment itself instead of the headaches of owning it. And also manufacturers are kind of repositioning to see how they can fulfill that demand. And then in the middle here, we see three key words: efficiency, quality, and revenue. So regardless of the trends of the day that we have here or the trends of the year, these three keywords are always super important, as most of you on this call probably are well aware of, that being efficient, driving quality, and driving revenue, those are things that are always very top of mind for manufacturing. So, but let's dive a little bit deeper into those three trends that we just talked about, beginning with disruption proof all the way to the left here. So it's about agile business models and mitigating rapid change. So even if your staff isn't there and you're not able to travel, so it's very much driven by the pandemic, but to be able to continue to sell, and we have remote selling and promoting new online tools so you can do more of the buying experience or the selling experience online. It's about having a much better understanding and leveraging data operationally so that you can make quick decisions and understand what's going on and how can we mitigate that change as quickly as possible, dealing with these constant disruptions in factories and stuff like that. But so really becoming much more nimble and agile in how manufacturers kind of go about their business. And a lot of that has to do with to deploy different type of digital technologies to become more automated and less reliant on individual people. There's also the resource scarcity. So Markus talked about it in his presentation, but then there's also the kind of the human capital aspect of it as well. In the US, we have this whole mass resignation going on where employers are having a very hard time both finding and attracting talent, but then also retaining that talent. So manufacturers have to deal with how do you kind of keep the doors open and keep operating and keep moving forward, even though you have a hard time having the right people in place and being able to go about your business. And the same thing in terms of materials and supply. We have this semiconductor shortage. We have supply chain disruptions. So how are you able to kind of manage these different scarcities? And then finally, the short-term supply chain issues. Hopefully they get cleared up in the relatively short future, at least the ones that have really been kind of amplified from COVID. But here it kind of helps for the manufacturers to get a better insight into their supplier status. So they just get a better understanding and can kind of have a bit more foresight and really be in a better position to react to different type of disruptions that occur more frequently nowadays. Moving on to the second trend that we work with here at Tacton, power of experience. And like I mentioned in the slide above, this is all about this continuation of B2C expectations being put in a B2B buying experience. And especially with the millennials rising, you have the same experience or the same expectation that you have when you use Netflix or Spotify or you get an Uber. And I know it's a very different thing to buy complex manufactured equipment online, but you still have the same, those are the expectations that you bring with you into your online buying experience. So it's definitely something that it's becoming more and more of importance for B2B manufacturers. We see this transition from selling to buying. So before, historically, manufacturers would kind of dictate the journey and sell to the customer. But now we see much more. It's the end customer who's actually dictating the terms and dictating how they want to buy and how they want to receive information and how they want to interact with you. So very much going from selling to buying and understanding that journey that the buyer goes through. We have this hybrid buying. I think you can call it many different names. It's pretty similar to omni-channel. We heard in the previous presentation about all the different type of channels that are now being deployed. And here I think it's key that like the lines between these channels continue to blur. So regardless of which channel you're interacting with, the end customer still has this expectation of having a consistency across the different channels and really delivering on that consistency, regardless if you're interacting on a tool online, if you're chatting with someone, if you're having a video call, if you're emailing, whatever it is, the end customer still has that expectation of consistency throughout. And something that goes very much hand in hand with that is reducing friction. So really understanding the buyer's journey and removing as many pain points and making it as frictionless and seamless as possible. And then finally, it's looking at the entire customer life cycle. So this movement towards equipment as a service so you're going all the way from order to fulfillment to usage, and really understanding from the buyer's perspective or from the customer's perspective, what is important to them and how are they going to live and operate with these different products and equipment, and to really consider that whole life cycle and not just consider the production and the sale of that, but to kind of have a more holistic approach to your relationship with the buyer. And then finally, we have evolving value chains, something that goes very much into this holistic customer life cycle is the new partnerships that the manufacturers are exploring. So they're obviously not going to do everything themselves, but by partnering up with the right type of companies, they can really serve their customers throughout that life cycle. So identifying which type of partners they need and really collaborating with them to really fulfill and give that complete customer lifecycle experience. Manufacturers are definitely looking to reshore, to kind of regain control. Before, we had this global drive of globalization and this interconnectedness, and that will definitely continue to a large extent going forward. But maybe we see in the future where maybe we'll have like a North American supply chain, a European supply chain, and an Asian supply chain, where manufacturers are wanting to bring back and gain a bit more control of their manufacturing. There's also kind of on the flip side of that is location independence. So now in the post-COVID world, where anyone can basically work from anywhere, and this is something that any type of customer or any type of company deals with in terms of you can have employees everywhere. So just how do you deal with having a staff that is kind of spread out across the globe? Proactive go-to-market models, something many manufacturers are looking at. And there's a lot of the manufacturers that we speak with, they have a lot of things they got to do to be able to start selling online, but definitely looking at how can they enable a better online experience. But in order to do so, you really have to have figured out your back end and have your data in order and have it automated and have the necessary technologies in place on the back end to really expose your products to the front end to the customer. And then finally, leveraging data to understand the entire supply chain. And that really just goes back into what I mentioned a little bit before in the disruption-proof bubble of having this transparency, having this insight in your supply chain to understand what's going on and to be able to make better decisions. And then these two super trends, the two mega trends that permeate throughout here, sustainability. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind here, it's not only sustainability in terms of the environment, but the sustainability in terms of social and corporate governance. Those aspects also play in there. But I do think in the manufacturing segment, what is most important to us is the environmental aspect of it. That's where we really can make a big difference, and that's where these requirements from regulators are coming. We definitely see that in Europe. I think it's a little bit different perspective in the US, but the US is such a huge country, and so I think it varies depending on where you look in the US. But that definitely based on our conversations and what we're seeing is there is a bit more urgency in terms of sustainability in Europe compared to the US, but it's definitely coming over there too. And then equipment as a service, this push towards access instead of ownership. The customer doesn't want to have to deal with all the pains of owning and wants the benefits of getting access and the outcomes that the products provide. So we see things of these like usage-based models and outcome-based models, but really this push to getting access to the equipment instead of owning it. So let's talk a little bit about what this actually means to manufacturers. What are the implications? So one, for disruption proof, that's really to a continued emphasis on digital transformation. So a very strong need for smart technologies, be it operational technologies or be it sales technologies, that really automate the processes on the back end, provide more insight into operations, and really to become less reliant on individual people. We have we see this time and time again where a lot of like the configuration knowledge is within certain individuals' minds. So really to kind of download that into a system. So regardless if people are at home sick or you're not able to get hire the people that you need to employ, that you still have the systems in place and the technologies in place to still move forward and make some good headway. Power of experience, and this is really all about enhancing your digital channels with tools and capabilities that allow the buyers to perform an ever-increasing part of the buying journey online. So it's something we've seen for many, many years now where the customers are wanting to do more online and they want to do it on their time and they want to interact on their own schedule. And to do that, you really have to provide that online experience where you have the tools and you have the capabilities so that they can play around and configure products and play around with the pricing and really get all the information that they need without having to physically sit next to a person and go through maybe the more traditional or historical type of sales journey. The evolving value chain, that kind of goes back to understanding the holistic experience of the customer and to secure these relevant partnerships that promote that entire customer lifecycle or experience. So understanding that it's no longer just this, you produce a product and you sell it, but to understand that this is how the customer is going to use the product and then really delivering on that entire journey. and to invest in technologies that support your direct sales channels or your direct sales capabilities. Sustainability, a huge one. And that's we see this much more in Europe, I think, but that the European manufacturers will soon need to comply with much stricter environmental sustainability requirements. There are other, as I said earlier, there are these social and corporate governance aspects in regards to sustainability that are important to be cognizant of, but primarily for us within the manufacturing space, it's the environmental where we can really make a big impact. The public has been having making more and more attention regarding sustainability in recent years, and finally the politicians have kind of caught up. And okay, we expect many more regulations coming for the manufacturing companies, and this really puts a lot of changes to manufacturing, both if you look at the supply chain, how you source different supplies, but the product development, how you build your products, how you think about the life cycle of those products. The energy usage in your factories to transition to green energy, use more batteries and stuff like that. So it has a very, very wide range of implications to manufacturers. And then finally, equipment as a service. And it started, I think it was Boeing, or it was Rolls-Royce, that pioneered it back in the 60s, I think it was. But now it's really starting to take off much more within manufacturing, and really going to require an enormous shift in how manufacturers operate and do business. And a few key enablers here that really need to be in place to enable this is IoT. You really need to connect your products and equipment so that you can understand them and you can measure them while they're operational. Digital twins, which is a digital replication of your physical product, so you can measure and actually understand how that product is being used and if there's any wear and tear, and also helps you perform any predictive maintenance and stuff like that. And then finally, a smaller one, but a digital platform where customers can administer their products and services. So if the customer wants to kind of change their subscription or add something or amend something, that's definitely something that they would need to be able to do online. And that is it for me. And handing back over to you, Cecilia.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you, both of you, for giving your view, both Markus and Daniel. And now we will open up for the panel discussion. And also here then to join in the panel discussion today as well, we have DJ Monzyk, a marketing strategist at Ketiv, and DJ has deep experience in software and startups. And prior to joining Ketiv, DJ also worked for a configure price and quote startup. And a warm welcome to you, and we're so glad to have you here today to giving more the North America perspective.
Thank you so much for having me, Cecilia.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you. So now, as I said, we're going to open up for the panel discussion. So as I said previously, feel free to add your questions in the question section, and we'll try to cover as many of these as possible. But let's get started with a few. So as we have discussed, the customer experience and digitalization are not the latest trends. This we have seen for quite a few years now. But what are the new accelerating aspects which you see? So let's start with you, DJ. What do you see on the market for now?
Sure. I don't know if I'll have anything super unique to say here. I think our speakers covered it very well, but I think the key elements that I'm looking at are risk reduction, right? We talked about what the pandemic can do or has done for us, and how taking control to operate more locally can have a major benefit. So American manufacturers especially are looking to take that on and reduce the risk by, bringing more on shore and reducing the length of that supply chain, right? The resource scarcity as a result of all these changes, both human and physical, have been pretty dramatic, right? The way we work, how we hire, how we source our goods is all changing. So I think it's all connected, but if you kind of turn it away from the company and look at the customer, I think that's probably the biggest shift, right? The customer empowerment that's happened. The Amazons, the Zappos, the Southwest Airlines of the world have really changed what it means to be a customer-oriented company. And like we said, that's requiring companies to supply an e-commerce-like experience, even if their products haven't traditionally aligned with that type of approach. Customers are expecting quick, flawless delivery of their products. They want strong and intelligent support after the sale. So they really want a 360-degree experience. And I think manufacturers aren't necessarily used to providing that. So it's a big shift in mentality to become more of a customer-centric organization than being kind of a product-centric one.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Markus, what would you add to this?
No, I think DJ said it well. Maybe, what I can add is, although we've seen this massive shift when it comes to, let's say, digitized sales and service, at the same time, what we hear in this survey is that many executives don't feel that they have the operating model still well in place to continue to do this, well at scale and in a stable manner. I think one of the respondents said something like, our current approach to contactless is a little bit put together by duct tape. So I think that will be a focus for many going forward.
Yeah, thank you. That was a fun quote. But Daniel, you're also hosting our advisory board. So what do you hear coming from them in the advisory board? And also a big part of the manufacturing companies have been around for some time and therefore might have sitting on challenges with less digitalized processes, lack of data. What would be your advice to them to get started and things to be mindful of?
For sure. So the two most previous advisory boards that we've had over here at Tacton have been about sustainability and e-commerce. And around sustainability, I think some of the key takeaways that I've taken with there kind of been the stark differences between American and European customers when you look at environmental sustainability. But then when you look at it from a more holistic perspective, when you include the social and corporate governance, I think they're much more closely aligned. So there's a lot going on there, and that's definitely one thing. The other advisory board that we had around e-commerce, the main takeaway there for me was that, many manufacturers want to move in that direction and the customer is really demanding it, but there's so many things that the manufacturer has to sort out before they're able to kind of expose their products online. You really need to figure out your back end first and get that much more structured and digitized before you can start exposing your products online, because it's a very difficult thing and you need the type of tools online too to be able to sell complex manufactured equipment online. So I think my key takeaway there is figure out the back end first. Once you have the back end sorted out, then you can start exposing it to the front end. And then the second part of your question there, Cecilia, about the data aspect and kind of getting up and running. I think obviously the quality of data is crucial. And I think my key comment there would be that each department should own the data. So the marketing department or the marketing team should own their data. The product data should be owned by the product team. And it really shouldn't be like that IT owns all the data.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Then Markus, you mentioned the servitization and outcome-based selling. So what we've seen in the trend analysis, as you also mentioned in the presentation, is that this is also connected to a more sustainable way of buying and the full life cycle management. So you also mentioned this of circle business model scaling. Can you give some further input on that and what you see working with your clients?
Yeah. I mean, in the sectors, the concept of service contracts that to some degree have a link to equipment performance or uptime, I think is well established in at least many of these subsectors. But I think there's two aspects of sustainability that has accelerated this and also pushed it one step further to this notion of equipment as a service that we talked about. And one of those sustainability related things is electrification. Usually electrification means, at least for now, a more costly or more high capex product, but that has a lower operating cost over its life cycle. So I think we see many of our clients sort of struggle to get acceptance from their customers with that financial profile, and they're shifting to a more equipment as a service type revenue model helps overcome some of that and makes it easier to scale. I think that is one of the drivers, and then I think the other driver is this shift to lower carbon materials and the shortage of such materials that I mentioned, which then forces some of these companies to explore, increasing longevity of the equipment, reusing more of the equipment, and so on, which brings us to the circular business model point. So I think the reasons why we believe this has sort of started to accelerate now recently.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And you also mentioned the flexibility in spend, moving over to a little bit of another topic. So the flexibility in spend and the lower appetite for large capex spend. So how do you see that driving change? Of course, I mean, that's also accelerating the equipment as a service. But what are the other effects we see in the value chain?
I think in the value chain and in the supply chain, there is this point on the shortages that has become very clear, and I think that has beyond forcing companies to rethink their supply chain setup, it has also sort of forced companies to rethink also how the products are designed and configured. For example, pushing for more modular products where you actually can create more tailoring and complexity towards the customer, but without creating the same complexity in the back end and in your value chain. But we'd love to hear DJ and Daniel's thoughts on this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for me, the circular business model, is critical, right? Getting that lifecycle management piece is key. So, I kind of go back to the mention of data earlier. For me, data is a huge component of this. Daniel pointed out a good point, which is we need to look at systems and teams and how they control their data, but there still is an end-to-end data quotient that is really quite important in manufacturing. And I think a lot of companies are starting with looking at those teams, but when you talk about digital transformation, it's going to require a true end-to-end perspective for the product creation, as well as that other piece we talked about with that 360-degree view of the customer. So I think data kind of enables that life cycle, in my opinion. So that's what I'd add to it.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that made me think of from our recent advisory board around e-commerce or equipment as a service is this kind of, for software companies, it's quite easy to shift to a software as a service company. You kind of build your software once, you continue to improve it, but then you can license it out. Versus for manufacturers, they continually need to build their products and bear that cost. So for them, there is this inherent obstacle to transition to equipment as a service. They're used to recuperating that cost that they've invested in producing the product. They're used to recuperating that right away because they'll need to reproduce those products the whole time. So that definitely, there is that inherent obstacle that manufacturers face because they're dealing with products instead of software.
Yeah, perfect. Then, it's also, as we have touched on, a shift to circular products and taking responsibility for the full product life cycle now with the new legislations coming from the European Union, as you also mentioned, Daniel. So how do you see these companies adjusting to this? Is this anything you've seen so far with?
Sure. So we definitely see a lot of activity here. And what it really boils down to is how manufacturers can produce products in a more sustainable way, primarily from a more environmentally sustainable way. products that last longer. Now that if they're going to take ownership of the product for a longer duration, they're much more incentivized to make sure that the products are last for a longer time and don't need to be replaced as frequently. So kind of activities that we see some of our customers working on and thinking about are performing life cycle assessments of the products and then optimizing their products and processes accordingly, powering the plants with energy from green and renewable sources, looking at the type of materials that go into the products, reducing the type of materials. So there's a bunch of different type of initiatives that our manufacturing customers are engaging in and looking at. But what it really comes down to is figuring out how can you operate in a more sustainable way and not only really fulfill the requirements that are set by regulators, but you can also see it as I think Markus mentioned it early on, but you can really see it as a kind of competitive advantage in how you go to market, and you can pitch yourself and present yourself as a sustainable option to your customers. It's growing in importance to the buyers and the customers, so it can definitely be seen as a competitive advantage if you really go for it.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. Markus, but have you seen or could share any interesting best practices so far on this topic?
I think, as Daniel mentioned, redesigning the products and the value chains of a company to make them more circular, of course, is needed, and you need to start with that. But it's not a low-hanging fruit, right? It takes years and years to go there fully. I think a best practice is, given that circularity also requires another revenue model, typically another governance, as was mentioned before, a lot of digital support and so on. So in our experience, what you can do is to try to build the business model and the system around it and the revenue model circular even before your products are fully circular, if you will, right? So you can let kind of the software, the services, and the way to do business run a little bit ahead of the sort of physical changes that you need to do.
Yeah, and then you also, of course, streamline and make sure that you're getting all things together at the same time. So then moving over to you, DJ. I mean, it's a global urgency, but our feeling is that it's a little bit more of a inattention in Europe, but not as urgent in North America. So what would be your view on this?
That's a good question. I'd like to tell you that you're wrong, but I'm probably not going to surprise this audience in suggesting that American politics plays a role here. As Markus said earlier in the presentation, sustainability is a mega trend, right? And I think that's, for many in the US, that is the case. However, a large contingent might consider that fake news, right? So whereas some factions are moving forward on thinking about their ecological impacts, others are really looking from a more legacy perspective. So I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think there's two ways to look at sustainability, right? There's sustainability for the business and the business model and how they're performing versus sustainability for the world in terms of ecology, right? I think the good news is there's a lot of overlap there in terms of outcomes, right? So by making good economic choices, you can often create good ecological outcomes. So I think American manufacturers see the value in choosing new designs and manufacturing methods. So I think that's one place where they're improving a lot. I think that dovetails into that idea of, local shoring again. How can we shrink the supply chain, not ship across seas? That's obviously reducing carbon every step of the way. And while doing so, how can they save in labor and time to market? All those things have an impact. So I think, we talk about impacting the bottom line. That's going to lead to ecologically sound outcomes. And I think that ecological mentality of Europe and other countries is really coming to the US. I think it is just a matter of time, like Daniel said, getting the manufacturers and the consumers on the same page so that there's that kind of drive to have a common goal of reducing carbon footprint is probably going to be the big shift that happens. So, I think what we're lacking is thinking about those things like end of life management and sustainable sourcing. I think that's probably the next stage of maturity for the US when it comes to thinking about ecological impact. And I think the reshoring aspect is really just accelerating that. So I'm hoping that as people see, as we reshore kind of the mess that's made in our own backyard, you start to see, instead of shifting the problem across seas, you're kind of realizing those impacts right here. So hopefully that will open some eyes and get people to see the value. And hopefully we're catching up very shortly here.
Yeah, absolutely. One other question we got in the question section is the digitization experience. Which part will have the most effect? What is the 80-20 benefit? It's in the customer experience. Then I would think so. Maybe Markus, do you have any comment on this?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to pick one thing in the journey or in your channels and focus on digitizing only that, because I think it's more around, I think Daniel mentioned it before, or if it was DJ, how it all fits together, right? And that the channels are complementing each other. And also when you, for example, transition from a digital interaction to a physical interaction, that there is a good link and sort of seamless transition. I wish I had the silver bullet, but I don't actually.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving forward then, we talked about being disruption proof is one of the key trends, of course, and meeting that it's nothing but easy. But with the current challenges we have within the supply chain, so what do you see from your side, Markus, on this topic going forward? When can we see a more balance? And you also mentioned the challenges onwards with the hunt for zero carbon materials. So is this within these materials where we will see the next challenge then for the purchasing and supply chain?
Yeah, so I think some of the major issues that we all experience now when it comes to freight capacity or semiconductors, that although probably it has already lasted longer than what anyone expected, we hope that this will stabilize in the next 1 to 2 years at least. Of course, no one knows. But what is very clear is that this shortage of low carbon materials, whether we talk about steel or aluminum or basically any other commodity almost, that will probably take decades to solve. At least from what we can see, there will not be a fast way to sort of ramp up production of these.